Thank you, Kelly. Okay, to start, I just want to read some of my thoughts that I've been writing for this week to share in this space with the purpose of time managing, but I'm going to do an active reading. So welcome everyone. This space, as I already said, was meant to be a conversation between my friend Lizah and I, as both as women of color from the global south, reflecting on topics that are connected to building the next system and also connected to how to do teachings from our own cultural backgrounds and perspectives. So, okay, let's start. As we mentioned in our abstract, the idea for this conversation was born when Lizah and I started to work closely with the Next System project, asking the theme and asking ourselves questions about how a teaching would look like from our own cultural backgrounds and places of origin, whether in South Africa or Latin America. The main idea of this conversation that is, by the way, we have been gathering some ideas, but we are hoping for more contributions in the future. We started asking these questions about how to translate editions. And I don't know if Lizah agrees with me, but every time that we tried to look for a translation of a teaching in our own cultural backgrounds, it was almost like if we would land in an empty space sometimes, right? So that kind of forced us or motivated us to do some research on how a teaching would look like from South America, South Africa, how that thing is named from our own cultures. So in my case, also working as the international organizer for the Next System, for me, it was essential to dive deep in the cultural context and in the intercultural dialogue of what teachings are in places that are not United States centered or North America centered. I posed myself questions like, do we have teachings in South America? How do we call them? To my surprise, we do have teachings in South America. We have been doing teachings for years, for decades maybe, and it's just that we call them in a different way. So this is kind of our contribution, Lizah and I, in trying to initiate how we call the teachings. But I think we do this only with the purpose to feed and enrich and expand the concept of the teaching itself. Because we think that will be a rich experience for building the next systems. I like to call it the next systems in plural, and this is why precisely because we have different next systems in different parts of the world, and that are not necessarily in the future but in the present. Okay, so Lizah and I enter this space with two main concepts. We explore our role as intellectuals of society through a concept that I borrow from an anthropology from Colombia, Miriam Jimeno. She talks about investigador ciudadano, which broadly translated, it means citizen researcher. This is a concept that recognizes social scientists not only as individuals with ethical concerns that they address through collaboration, but also as individuals shaped by their emotions, moral systems, political commitments. So in this sense, their participation in the field, quote unquote, has more to do with how they conceive of the nation who speaks, who remains silent, what is said, what rights are recognized, and which are denied. Miriam Jimeno emphasizes that citizens researchers do not confine themselves to ethical collaboration with communities or subjects of study. They actively engage in understanding and transforming the social dynamics they observe. We also enter this space, of course, with the very inspiring and brilliant ideas from Paulo Freire, this Brazilian scholar, activist, educator, who defines popular education as a liberatory dialogical process of collective learning designed for marginalized groups to develop critical consciousness, understand the reality, and organize for social change. Pedagogía popular or popular pedagogies transform the traditional power dynamic by viewing teachers and learners as co-creators of knowledge, emphasizing shared experience, critical reflection, and active participation to dismantle systems of oppression and empower people to become agents on their own liberation. So this is the two concepts that we enter with into this room, as citizens, researchers, but also as popular educators or through popular pedagogies. So we think that this cultural translation will enrich the conversation about popular empowerment from non-academic spaces, as Ben Mansky mentioned on his open session this morning. Building the new systems will require an opening our hearts and minds and learning from each other and from other different parts of the world. Okay, so this next system convergence offers an essential platform to engage with challenges by centering knowledge in practices from the global south, particularly those related to education as a tool of empowerment. As an anthropologist from Colombia living in Montreal, my reflections focus on the rich dialogues between teachings, pedagogical practice originated in the global north with other type of practices that are not north-centered. So as we know, the teachings historically emerged in the global north and the United States as intentional temporary educational gatherings designed to bring together communities of activists, scholars, and residents for in-depth discussion about war, injustice, justice, and systemic oppression. The teachings, their participatory nature breaks down hierarchies of knowledge, fostering collective critical consciousness and strategic mobilization. Yet, when transplanted outside their American origin, teachings enter into a dynamic dialogue with a variety of South American educational traditions and cultural practices that both resonate with and challenge, and I would say feed the frameworks of the teachings. In South America, Educación Popular, or popular education, stands as one of the most well-known educational traditions that aligns with and expands upon teachings principles. Rooted in liberation theology, emancipatory philosophies, and pedagogical philosophy of Paulo Freire, Educación Popular stresses the inseparability of education from culture, powers, politics, and praxis. It's an invitation for dialogic learning. Here, this type of learning, is firmly grounded in community experience, social justice struggles, and indigenous epistemologies, rendering education an embodied act of political empowerment rather than a mere intellectual exercise. Kelly, can we please start sharing the slides?
Yes, so sorry about that. Just pulling them up.
Yeah, in this part of my talk, I will start showing some pictures of some of these practices that are currently happening in South America that have many resonances and can enter into a conversation with the radical pedagogical framework of what a teaching is. Okay, so this is the title of presentation. Can you please go next? Yes. Okay, we can stay there for now. Beyond places like Colombia, Brazil, the concept of teachings finds close echoes in places like Mexico, where they have a cultural practice called La Otra Educación, the other education. By the way, these practices that I'm going to mention in this presentation are some of many, many others. But yeah, this practice emerged with indigenous and campesino movements to counteract exclusionary and colonial schooling system. It centers communal knowledge transmission, collective memory, and intergenerational learning as foundational to education's role in sustaining identity and resistance and resilience. Like the teachings, it creates participatory spaces, but it uniquely prioritizes respect for ancestral wisdom and territorial sovereignty as central educational values. Next slide, please. La Otra Educación is an alternative educational project not exclusive to Mexico, but with international reach, including other countries in Latin America, like Colombia, Bolivia, Peru. It is a type of education contextualized for rural and indigenous communities, focusing on autonomy, cultural identity, and resistance against dominant economic and political systems. This educational approach often emerges from social movements such as the Zapatistas and Campesino organizations, aiming to empower communities through a pedagogy that is non-hierarchical, but rather participatory, communal, and rooted in the realities of campesino life rather than conventional schooling models. Also, in places like Bolivia and Peru, the Ayllu tradition, can you please pass the slide? Next slide. No, go back, sorry. Yeah, that one. The Ayllu tradition offers another powerful cultural lens for rethinking, or another cultural lens from which we can have a more broad conception of what a teaching is. The Ayllu is a long-standing Andean social structure organizing community life around reciprocity, mutual aid, collective decision-making. Education within the Ayllu is not a separated institutional function, but it's interwoven with daily practice, ritual, and shared responsibility. When connected to the practice of the teachings, this Ayllu type of practices emphasizes the integration of education with lived community governance and holistic worldviews, challenging more segmented or formalized education models common in the global north. In contemporary Bolivia, Ayllus are spaces that also serve as basis for indigenous identity, political organization, decision-making in political terms, and also territorial governance. The Ayllu system involves a hierarchy of leadership that balances the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities in the collective, in the community, often involving both male and female leaders. Ayllu communities maintain their distinct cultural practices and laws, emphasizing coexisting with nature and comprehensive view of social and environmental harmony. These communities participate in collective decision-making and communicate through traditional authorities recognized nationally, such as those in the National Council of Ayllus. Yeah, here in the picture we see like an example of this type of meetings or the Ayllus. Okay, complementing these ways of learning and pedagogical educational experiences, we have the tradition of the cabildos abiertos, or open cabildos across many countries in Latin America, including Colombia, my country. These are open assembly councils where communities engage in democratic debate and joint decision-making. While not always framed explicitly as educational, their dialogical horizontal nature resonates strongly with the teaching's objectives, reinforcing the idea that critical education must be collective, participatory, and tied to political causes. In the Brazilian context, we also have many other movements that resonates with the teachings, but there's a one very popular that is movimientos populares, popular movements. They have long used educational workshops and community assemblies as sites of resistance and empowerment. These settings foster critical consciousness and often explicitly tied to direct action campaigns around particularly land rights and also issues connected with labor justice, environmental defense, and other causes that are integrate reflections and practice in unique way and inseparable ways. In terms of cultural translation, these South American experiences expand and Mexican experience expand the concept of teachings by embedding them within the frameworks that emphasize collective identity, ancestral knowledge, and territorially rooted sovereignty. They challenge the more episodic nature of teachings, but they also feed the teachings by stressing continuity. That means the fact that education is not isolated to discrete events, but education as a persistent communal process tied to history, place, and ongoing struggles in different places in South America and Central America. So this dialogue also reveals important epistemological questions. Whose knowledge is valued? How is knowledge produced, shared, and contested? I just would like to conclude by saying that South American practices often are, this is an invitation to see South American practices often subvert Eurocentric capitalistic notions of education by prioritizing and kind of bringing to the table oral traditions, education seen also from a perspective of oral traditions, intergenerational dialogue, relational ways of knowing that resist commodification or standardization. In global terms, when we talk about the goals of building a new system, incorporating these resonances is crucial. Building the new systems required epistemic pluralism, cultural plurality, and education that is deeply responsive to local needs and histories, and also requires opening our minds and expanding horizons. As we discussed this morning with Ana Inés' talk, the next systems could be a vision of the future, but also the next systems are a vision of the present. The next systems are already here, but we need to expand our horizons. For closing, I'm taking more time than I was supposed to take, I'm sorry. Teaching and learning across this context share a present political purpose to create collective knowledge that is a foundation for social justice, community resilience, and system transformation. By valuing these diverse pedagogical forms and concepts, the next systems open itself to richer possibilities, building new futures shaped by solidarity, cultural rootedness, and emancipatory practice. So these spaces and local practices that I have brought to this conversation, few from many, many others, prefigure the colonial pedagogy. Knowledge is not owned by experts or co-created, but rather is co-created through storytelling, ritual, deliberation, and lived experience. They remind us that in the Global South, education has always been more about the literacy and local practices and education built up from a struggle or resilience. Education in South America has always been about liberation, identity, and belonging to a place. And I think all these concepts can be useful or can feed or nourish in some way how are we thinking globally about the teachings that are happening in November. Okay, I'll end with that. Sorry for the long talk. And my friend Lizah, so yeah, go. Were you
Thanks,
saying
Daisy.
something, Kelly? Sorry.
Or did Kelly want to come through first?
No, I just wanted to see if you wanted the slide still.
No, I'll just want the last slide, like right at the end, and I'll let you know. Is that okay?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, the second last slide. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Daisy. I should also, I want to start off by greeting everyone who's here. In Zulu, so I'm going to say Sawubona, and you're supposed to say Sawubona back. And it means I see you and I acknowledge your presence. So also in thinking about the conversation that Daisy was talking about at the beginning, where we were trying to like contextualize teachings from our own intercultural context. Daisy being from Colombia, born and raised, I think. She's now in the diaspora like me, but she was born and raised there. And myself, I was born in Zimbabwe and raised in South Africa. So I'm bringing here more of a sub-Saharan context of teachings. So when we were reflecting, my aim and our aim really was to explore, like what Daisy said, the intersections and the resonances between teachings and other cultural categories or educational practices that are developed in South America in this case, and sub-Saharan Africa. So in thinking about this, earlier on, I think Daisy also mentioned Jimino 2011, and they talk about the inseparability of education from culture, power, social justice, politics, and indigenous epistemology. So my first step was to take more like a concrete analysis or to really look at what history is saying about today's interpretation of what teach-ins are in South Africa. So my first step was to ground this inquiry of what are teach-ins, how do they align? Just like I greeted you in Zulu, I said Sawubona. If it was in a Western or global North context, it's hello, good afternoon, but we would say Sawubona no matter what time of day it is. So in thinking about that, my first step was to ground this inquiry in the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which is captured by the Afrosym I am because we are. And Ubuntu is embeds teach-ins in the cultural context of sub-Saharan Africa. And Ubuntu places community well-being as the foundation for individual well-being. So it really says, in this particular case, what was I asking? I was saying, how does Ubuntu infuse itself into the concept of a teach-in within the sub-Saharan context? So again, Ubuntu was really exemplified in South Africa during the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where its tenets such as forgiveness, solidarity, accountability, restitution, guided the process that helped shape what is now regarded as one of the most democratic constitutions in the world. So it follows that teachings in South Africa, regardless of their name, their shape, their form, how they are practiced, they would inevitably carry the spirit of Ubuntu. So with this in mind, I tend to exploring the history, like I said, of teachings in South Africa, and try to identify spaces, events, and concepts that intersect or resonate with this practice of teachings. And in South Africa, the term teach-in, if you're looking at the historical context, you'd see that during the 1960s to the 1980s, teachings were used in South Africa as a tool to resist the apartheid government. So would see teachings featuring films such as The End of Dialogue, which was a very prominent film that had been banned by the apartheid government, as well as they would also really just, the pedagogy of exchanging with the African National Congress activists and members of the liberation movement and allies who were in exile at the time. So during the apartheid era, teachings became a vital form of resistance and political education. They were not renamed or reframed. Rather, that English term teach-ins was used explicitly. And in that particular context, the teachings carried two interconnected objectives. One was to serve as a counter-information system. So they directly challenged the regime's propaganda by disseminating banned facts, like in the case, the example I gave you, the film of Ending Dialogue, and really exposing the realities of apartheid and publicizing the goals of the liberation movement. So the apartheid government was feared, and it had a strong, propaganda machine, which the teachings was sort of coming and serving as a counter information system. Mechanism or platform. And then the second objective was to convert awareness into action. So thinking about tactical strategies and even also long-term strategies. So they were designed, the teachings were designed to educate, rally from both domestic and international audiences, transforming passive sympathy into active solidarity and mobilization within the broader resistance movement. So stories are told, and I love those stories. They're told all the time how the teachings would happen in the underground. And this will be in spaces like churches, mosques, spaces of worship, whatever it was. The teachings would occur there. They would also occur on campuses. They would occur in the taverns, which are like these bars in the townships where the people lived. They would occur in town, in sort of halls, town halls, parks, and so on and so on. And what was happening there was a form of guerrilla education that was powered by Ubuntu. So the undergroundness really functioned well because of Ubuntu. So how the message would sort of go around, subverting, the brutal apartheid regime at the time. So because it was that guerrilla education type of, underground movement and space and pedagogy that is, it empowered the resistance with information and solidified a community of opposition, marking them these teachings as a vital component of intellectual and moral struggle. So after looking at that, I then say, but these teachings, if they were so vibrant during that time, what is the modern day interpretation of a teaching? And teachings have continued in the form of a teaching in more academic spaces. For example, the recent Roads Must Fall campaign and the Fees Must Fall campaign in South Africa, which happened mostly with students on campuses. So they also use the tool or the mechanism of a teach-in to gather support for those movements. So in other words, teachings in South Africa about, you know, like what Deissy was saying, are really the resistance, you know, sort of embedded in the struggle and resisting against the system that is currently there, which is supposedly another form of oppression and not really addressing the needs of the working class and, you know, maybe also other peripheral communities. So that's how the teachings are sort of, you know, playing in South Africa. And then besides that, I started thinking, but, you know, what about pre-colonial times or maybe prior to the 1960s? Or what would teachings would have looked like? And I thought, you know, the word Indaba, which is really a lived practice in South Africa. So in the homes, we also have our own Indabas, clans have Indabas, villages have Indabas, and the word Indaba itself means a gathering or a discussion or a dialogue. And the nature of the dialogue is also in most of the times continuous and evolving. But in this particular case, I then looked at how the term teach-ins in the modern day context of South Africa has been perhaps to some extent co-opted, but I would say it's evolving. And because we see the use of the Indaba terminology in spaces like large conferences, like your tourism Indaba in South Africa or the Africa Mining Indaba. And I want to give particular highlight to the mining Indaba because of how it has grown to become Africa's largest mining investment gathering. And now emphasizes themes such as partnership, community integration, and sustainable development. Only after what is called the Marikana Massacre in South Africa. So this, the Indaba started in 2005, if I'm not wrong. I need to double check that. But along the way, we had the Marikana incident happening, I think around 2018. And in that particular case, what happened is that mining labor unions organized against a big mining company, which is also global, called Lonmin. And they were advocating for different you know, different labor rights, better working conditions, minimum wage, and so on and so forth. And the South African police was sent to open fire on these mining workers, and it became a nationwide crisis at that particular moment. And we see the mining industry begin to shift or, you know, self-reflect in the trajectory it had been going, maybe perhaps focusing on a growth, you know, capital-centric model of trying to do an Indaba, and really coming back and saying, what is this all about? And this dialogue changed its nature because there was this huge crisis. Also, the mining Indaba has recently started to debate the Zama mining. These are artisanal miners. The Zama dilemma, it's called in South Africa. These artisanal miners, they contribute to the economy because they go and mine in old mine shafts, but some of them get trapped and they die in their numbers in there. And the mining Indaba has had to shift, and in this evolution, we can see a shift towards participatory dialogue, bringing its communal Ubuntu roots with the teach-in style engagement on pressing social and environmental challenges that South Africa is going through. And then quickly, I want to just highlight other sort of terms or social constructs like Pungwe in Zimbabwe, which actually is also known as schools without walls. And this originated in the Zimbabwean liberation struggle. And the Pungwe or the teaching would happen all night. So it was an all-night gathering in rural areas in Zimbabwe. And these Pungwes really were about provisioning for freedom fighters and also political education. So they were those days, apparently, you would find there were spaces of song, storytelling, poetry, performance, and other forms of political education. And Pungas were very participatory when these stories are told. And the pedagogy was oral, it was dialogue, it was experimental, and these were teachings about oppression, strategies of resistance, and collective survival. So just like your teachings in the 1960s and 80s in South Africa, and they were really these cultural, also infused with a lot of culture. So they were also known sometimes as cultural circles. They disrupted formal education, hierarchies, and made knowledge production communal, and they were rooted in lived struggles. You can put the picture, Kelly, thank you. I'm almost done. I have two last examples, quick examples, again, of teachings in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. So quickly, the other one I want to talk about is Ngidi or Chinamwari, which is a pedagogy of joy, and it's known in the Shona culture, and it's a celebratory type of learning space and gathering. Sometimes these go on for months within a particular year, so they are annual in nature, and they emphasize the rites of passage, coming of age, embedding identity and culture, and it is also centered on dance, music, food, and communal sharing. So while they are celebratory, these spaces, the Mugidis, transmit cultural knowledge, norms, and intergenerational knowledge. And again, they are about participants who learn about their kinship and solidarity and resilience. So these Giddies can be seen as a pedagogy of joy and identity, where learning is embodied, celebratory, and connected to cultural survival. The last one is the DARE, which is a community governance and conflict resolution mechanism and pedagogy space. And this DARE is it's a Shona traditional court or council, usually held under a tree, where elders, family members, and communities gather to resolve disputes, discuss justice, and govern communal affairs. So in comparable to, I think it's Daisy, you'll have to forgive me, Cabidos, Betos, I know I've chopped whatever language that is, open councils in Latin America. And DAREs serve as spaces where communities learn civic responsibility and challenge exclusion. And in these DAREs, just like your Pungwes, your Indabas, your Giddies, they are rooted in Ubuntu, and they create horizontal collective learning that is continuous and that is not top down, but rather, I guess, bottom up. And they nurture solidarity, dignity, and inclusion. And central to the ethic of Ubuntu, except for the co-option of Indabas in this case, all four concepts are named, all four concepts that I've named above embody teachings, not as a temporary academic event, but ongoing lived pedagogies of liberation and community survival. So that's what I heard in terms of this particular conversation and that we're having with Deissy, and I'll give it back to Kelly and Deissy. But I'm available for questions.
Thank you so much. It looks like we do have a question in the Q&A asking if you, either of you have any experience with or knowledge about using nonverbal techniques like formal theater, Augusto Ball's Theater of the Oppressed, or ritual practices and or other popular education languages of the people.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Lizah, I can start replying to this question. I do have experience working with communities applying this type of pedagogies in their own spaces, localities. Part of my PhD was, to conduct to apply popular pedagogy methodologies, especially, okay, so I'm Colombian, right? Especially in the context of victims of the armed conflict in my country, in Colombia, where different communities who have been victims of forced displacement or forced disappearance, and other type of capitalistic devastation situations. I've been working with them. Kelly, I cannot share links on the chat with the participants. Can I send you a couple of links? So John can take a look at this type of practices that I've been collaborating with. But one of them is called Las Tejedoras de la Memoria, that in English means something like, the memory weavers. These are a collective of Black women from the Pacific region in Colombia who have gathered together during many years to weave and sew together as a collective. This has been for so many years a healing process from the wounds from the war, and also a therapeutical space, but also it's a space that is it's educational in the sense that they learned how to shape their struggle in political terms, and they learned through these artistic practices and healing practices how to advance in their denouncements, but also in their claims for social justice and human rights petitions. So this is like one tiny example. Yeah, I'll end with that. Lizah, I don't know if you have an answer for this.
Great. We actually have another question in the chat directed at Lizah, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce that one. Have these local resolution practices moved into higher levels of governance, i.e. provincial and or national?
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Dave, for the question. I would take a stab on this based on how I'm tracking. So currently I'm also in the diaspora. So I try and track what's happening in South Africa with some colleagues, but I could be left behind a little bit. But for sure, I know local resolutions have been integrated at community governance levels. So like your municipal level, you see a lot of these practices of Ubuntu like infused, and even the way the mechanisms within those municipal level activities. I'll give you an example. There's a water stewardship program that I was working with based in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and in that it was based on, we were calling it a cross-sector social partnership because all the community members, including the local governance, like your chiefs, your indunas, we call them, they were involved in that particular water stewardship program, which was looking at water governance in that particular watershed. I am not sure how engaged they are at provincial and national level, and I would love to propose, of which I need to research more, that at that level, it seems to be very like tokenistic. It's not really embedded. So there's a lot of talk of Indaba. Even when the president does his annual, I think it's a parliament speech, there's a lot of trying to infuse or integrate some Ubuntu tenants and systems, governance systems in, but it's not really recognized at those levels. That's how I would, sort of answer that question. I would like to say I would need to do a little bit more research. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question, so feel free to put it in the chat, in the Q&A, or even I think you might have participants might be able to raise their hands if they have any questions. All right, if there are no final questions, do either of you have any final remarks that you want to leave us off with?
Do you want to, Lizah?
Okay. I just wanted to thank everyone who joined us, and if they could contribute more to this discussion that myself and Deissy want to take forward, even to in more long term in thinking about popular education, popular pedagogies, and how they interface with Western education and other sort of traditional forms of education. But thank you everybody for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, this is an ongoing project. And as we try to prefigure, how the next systems would look like from other places that are not Europe or North America centered, we need to ask ourselves these questions and these translations and intercultural dialogues. And yeah, this is one of many other pedagogical experiments, this conversation that we have brought here today. So thank you. And thank you so much, Kelly, for hosting this event.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you both so much. This was such a wonderful session. And I learned so much. I went ahead and I put Deissy's and Lizah's email in the chat for everyone if you are interested in following up a little bit more. And we might have a second for a last question, but if not, we can go ahead and hop off early right in between the next session. All right.
Sorry, Kelly. Dave, if Dave is still there, I forgot to talk about how they're using Indabas at the COP. I think the last COP at the UN climate conference. Yeah, they used the Indabas there. I forgot to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.